Michael Sean Winters to you this afternoon. Michael Sean is the columnist for the National Catholic Reporter and the blogger on Distinctly Catholic. He's published 2 books, Left at the Altar, How Democrats Lost the Catholics and How the Catholics Can Save the Democrats, written in 2008. I think they have a bit of work to do still. And he also wrote a biography of Reverend Jerry Falwell, God's Right Hand, how Jerry Falwell made God a Republican and baptized the American right in 2012. And today he's going to speak on Catholics and politics. We're in this beautiful room where we have the tapestries of all the traditional and modern saints. And I want you to consider that 100 years from now, you will walk in here and you will look up at the wall and you will see Michael Sean Winters up on the tapestry. So with that, we welcome you to San Diego.
I don't think sanctity is ever going to be one of my specialties, I'm afraid to say. But it's good to be here. I've never been to San Diego until I arrived yesterday. I was supposed to get in Sunday night, but was part of the American Airlines meltdown and had to overnight in lovely Dallas, Fort Worth Airport. But it is great to be, and what a beautiful campus you all have. So thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. So I guess I want to start by saying that I think not just for Catholics, but for all Americans, we talk about religion and politics in the worst ways. And the first example I want to give goes back to the 2008 Republican presidential primaries. And Senator John McCain was asked the question, do you believe in evolution? And he paused. Now, in that pause, I'm willing to bet he was not evaluating the scientific evidence for the theory of evolution. He was evaluating the political consequences of trying to get the nomination of a party, the base of which is fundamentalist Christians who don't believe in evolution, even though, of course, he believed in it. Now, we as Catholics don't labor under that fundamentalist delusion. So if I asked this room of Catholics, do you believe in evolution? You would all say, yes. No, no one believes in evolution. It's science. That's the whole point, is that you don't have to believe in it. You demonstrate science. These saints believed in faith. It's an article of faith that you believe in. So even there on something, you're all educated, but we do that. We say, believe the science. It's a catchphrase now. No, you don't believe science. That's the point. Take another one from recent examples. I have to admit, I smiled the smile of deep irony the first time I heard an anti-vaxxer say, it's my body, my choice. Where have I heard that phrase before? And of course, this was a very conservative Catholic Christian saying, I don't want to have the vaccine because it was, created with abortion, an aborted embryo. And yet they were using the exact slogan of the pro-choice movement, my body, my choice. Third example, Mario Cuomo goes to Notre Dame and articulates a position which is still with us. It's essentially the position of Joe Biden. My church, I believe my church. I hold what the church teaches about abortion. I think it's immoral as a Catholic, but I can't legislate my morality on the country. We live in a representative democracy, and the voters, he then, of course, said of the great state of New York, said, they wanted abortion to be legal, and I am responsible to them as an elected official. That may be true, but there's no theory of government that has a claim on Mario Cuomo or Joe Biden's voice. And if they really believe what the church teaches about abortion, surely they have a moral obligation to persuade others that they're wrong. But if you're in the field of politics, you do that at your peril. And we're going to explore some of the reasons why being a conscientious Catholic at this moment in our nation's history is so perilous, because you are not permitted to ask certain questions anymore that I think are critical. How did we get here? I think that the first place I want to start is some large cultural issues that go way back. And the first is the ambient Protestant culture that the Catholic Church has always been wrestling with since colonial American times. And that has left us two great inheritances that I think are negative: a hyper-individualistic understanding of religion and a very anti-philosophic understanding of religion. And to give you an idea, we talk about the American founding as if it was this great religious event, like the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we're Christians, so we put ourselves in that. It's easy to forget how anti-Catholic the political ideology of the American Revolution was. So the First Continental Congress in 1775 issued an address to the people of Great Britain. And among the things that were said in that were, we think the legislature of Great Britain is not authorized by the Constitution to establish a religion, Catholicism, fraught with sanguinary and impious tenets, or to erect an arbitrary form of government in any quarter of the globe. Nor can we suppress our astonishment that a British Parliament would ever consent to establish in that country, Canada, a religion that has deluged your island in blood and dispersed impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion through every part of the world. That's what our founding fathers, that was written by John Jay, the first US Chief Justice, in an address to the inhabitants of Great Britain about Catholicism. That's pretty potent. This idea that I think the American Revolution era was a religious event is really complicated. And to the extent it was a religious event, it was deeply embedded in anti-Catholic ideas. There's, at the beginning of that 18th century, you have the Act of Union to unite Scotland, England, and Wales. And the way they did that was a negative definition, right? So if you were to be British, to create an idea of to be British was to be not French. That was meant that you were not subject to arbitrary government or to priestcraft was the phrase. And so this was their concept. Rule Britannia, they have the line in the chorus, Britons never, never will be slaves. Now they were not speaking to a fear that they would wake up as an African-American working on a plantation in South Carolina. It was that you would be subject to priestcraft and arbitrary government. And that's this ideology that you find in 1775 from the First Continental Congress being sent back to them to remind them of that. You also then have this ongoing anti-philosophic quality to American religion. I was watching a video of in 2016 at the Jewish Review of Books, a mentor of mine, Leon Wieseltier, was commenting on the fact that to be a Jewish American Jew, you need to have a certain worldview. And he said, but we don't. And he said, we're so politicized in this country, you could wake up an American Jew, or I would say an American Catholic in the middle of the night and say, what do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of the Iraq War? What do you think of Obamacare? And they would have an answer. But if you ask a Catholic in the middle of the night, what does it mean to be a Catholic? What does it mean to believe that God became incarnate? What does that mean for human dignity? Do they have the answers? I was out with friends last night for dinner and we were talking about how few Catholics know anything about Catholic social doctrine and what a great stance, we'll get back to that a little later in the talk about what a great stance it is to critique our culture, but also critique any culture. So that's the first point, the ambient Protestant influence and why I think American Catholicism has an unhappy relationship with politics. Second is the reduction of religion to ethics. Part of this is a leftover myth that if you bring dogma into the public square, you will reignite the 30 Years' War. Like this is, oh, you can't do that. We're all going to start killing each other again over religion. But you are allowed, you can't have a republic or self-governance of the individual or the country without some sense of morality. That morality has to be rooted in something. Chances are it's rooted in people's religions. So religion is allowed in the public square as an ethical authority. The problem with that is then that affects your self-definition and religion becomes not what we as Catholics understand it, but it becomes reduced to ethics. Huge problem, especially when ethical, that may have worked 200 years ago if there was a certain ethical consensus, but it's long since stopped working in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in this country for a variety of reasons. Third, you have what I would call the loss of Catholic identity in the post-war era as people moved to the suburbs. So in the 1930s and 40s, you had the Legion of Decency, which some of you who know from history, before a person could make a movie, they would have to talk to the review board, and the review board would say how much of a woman's cleavage could be shown on a film. How could a person who was, say, committing a crime in a movie, they had to be punished by the end of the movie. You couldn't have somebody go scot-free. And this was all staffed by Catholics because of the concentrated power that Catholics had at the box office in Catholic neighborhoods. And they could shut down a movie and say there was just not going to be any box office receipts. That sense of identity, if you asked a Catholic in the 1930s, where are you from? What would they say? Oh, I'm from St. Bernadette's, or I'm from Sacred Heart, or I'm from Our Lady of God. They would identify the neighborhood by the parish. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, people moved to the suburbs. You're no longer in the concentrated Catholic ghetto. That identity goes away. Now what matters is what car you buy or drive. Like that's, oh, he's the guy with the Volvo. You know, this is a different animal. And we've, one of the things I think happens today is you still have people who kind of, they want to go back to that golden age of American Catholicism of the ghetto, but there's no going back. That was then, this is now. It doesn't work that way. The fourth kind of, I'd say, substrata that affects politics that we don't often think about is, of course, consumerism. And the American dream in the post-war era shifts. So my grandparents came from Poland in 1912. And on that side, the Irish came the century before. And they never spoke a word of English. He was a bootlegger. But the dream was about getting out from under the heel of at that time, Russian tyranny. Still the dream, alas, in that part of the world. And again, something happens in the post-war era that whole sense that the American dream is about self-governance, about being free. Now it becomes about Target. Now it's about shopping. Now it's about consumerism. And this is not a 21st century thing. In 1959, there's a great little book by George Marsden, the historian of American evangelicalism, American evangelicalism at Notre Dame, called The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. And he recalls that in 1959, John Steinbeck, the great novelist, wrote to his friend Adlai Stevenson, twice the Democratic nominee for the presidency and governor of Illinois, quote, "If I wanted to destroy a nation, I would give it too much, and I would have it on its knees, miserably greedy and sick." In 1959, he said that. Think of how much more stuff we have been given since 1959. I'd also point out that the next year, Adlai Stevenson delivered the greatest quip in all of American history on the subject of religion and politics, when Norman Vincent Peale, the Protestant minister at Marble Collegiate Church in New York, said, "You can't vote for John F. Kennedy to be the president because he's Catholic." And Adlai Stevenson famously said, "I find the teachings of St. Paul appealing and the doctrines of Dr. Peale appalling." Favorite sentence of all time. It was also at this time that Reinhold Niebuhr pointed out that in the competition between Soviet communism and American capitalism, we sometimes overlooked the ways that there were commonalities, and especially when it came to materialism. And he wrote that we had been rather more successful practitioners of materialism as a working creed than the communists. And Niebuhr also noted that the United States was at once the most religious and the most secular of nations. A great key insight that I think we always need to remember. And again, this is in the 50s, the so-called golden age. So those are the things that leading up to 1960 and the early 60s are the substrata that I think are still with us. I'm not going to go at any length into the Second Vatican Council and the election of John Kennedy and Dignitatis Humanae and John Courtney Murray. That should be well known to any student of American Catholic history and politics. So let's look at some other developments after the council. The council closes in 1965. You have the rise of the counterculture, and the counterculture, you know, is a whiplash movement, right? Like so you had Americans who, we were the great country. We had won World War II. We were the greatest generation. All this kind of stuff, and then the 60s happened, and we start to question that. Francis George, who was the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, in his first dissertation, his second dissertation, his theology dissertation, he wrote about this. And this quote has always stuck with me. Americans, especially missionaries, who break out of this cultural conditioning and begin to see their native country through the eyes of a truly different people, sometimes turn American moralism on America itself. If the United States is not to be a beacon, the universally inclusive city on a hill, then it must be a sinkhole, the evil source of global exploitation. Sometimes this judgment is religiously justified as a prophetic stance. Sometimes in more sociological terms, disillusion calls itself countercultural. Criticism of institutions and social structures is not, however, countercultural in an anti-authoritarian society such as that of the United States, a country where the mass media lionize dissent. Nor is every social criticism prophetic. The Hebrew prophets, critical though they were, never told their people that they should renounce the past and cease to be Israelites. Rather, the prophets pointed to God and called their people back to their original covenant, to the best in themselves and their history. Modern alienation is not a biblical virtue. I sit with that and wrestle that all the time. And I think this is one of the intellectual pathologies of the left, that we felt this need to say, it's all bad. And it's like Howard Zinn is the beginning and last word on American history. He's a necessary corrective, but it's not the whole kit and caboodle. You then have, in the early 70s, the second kind of post-conciliar development that I think shapes things, which is obviously Roe v. Wade and the reaction to it. And I think the more I've studied that period, you get, on the part of the Catholic Church, it's hard for us to remember how shocked people were by that, and how the court's intervention short-circuited a debate that was going on in state legislatures in this country that might have gotten us to the kind of accommodation that most European countries have. Like in most European countries, abortion is allowed before 12, 14, 16 weeks. Those are the usual cutoffs. There's a couple outliers like us that allow it up, throughout the pregnancy, some that don't allow it at all. But that's the average. And I think we were headed toward that. And then the courts came in and short-circuited that. And we are still living with the reaction to Roe. It's become totemic, that on either side, whether you support it or oppose it, if someone says I'm opposed to abortion, we assume a whole bunch of things about that they may otherwise believe. There are very few liberals opponents of abortion left. There used to be a caucus in the Democrat as late as 2010 in the debate over the Affordable Care Act. There were 20 Democrats who insisted on having Hyde language and things like that. It's only 12 years ago. You also then, so Roe was 73, but in 72, in the Democratic primaries, something else happened. And it became a real awareness that George Wallace was very popular in certain Democratic enclaves in the North. And I think you can trace a trajectory from George Wallace's candidacy to Pat Buchanan's in 1992 to Donald Trump's in 1916 pretty easily. I think there's a continuity. That's also where the idea of a kind of aggressive racism comes into American politics in a way that was and is evil. With Reagan, you get a sunny face on some of those developments, but you also get the introduction of neoliberalism and the idea that Reagan famously said the scariest words in the English language: "I'm here from the government. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help." That this was scary. Well, our Catholic social teaching, that's not how we view it. Republicans like to co-opt the idea of subsidiarity, that decisions should be made at the lowest social level possible or the highest necessary. So a family should resolve a problem. If the family can't, the neighborhood. If it can't be the neighborhood, the city. If it can't be the city, the state, and on up. But subsidiarity, we forget there's a Latin root to the word, subsidium, to help. Like the separation of powers is not a Catholic concept. Subsidium is the very essence of the word, is to help, that the higher levels, that the government exists to help the lower levels achieve what is appropriate for them. That's never been part of the American political lexicon, and we pay a price for that. The other thing with neoliberalism that you get, obviously, is this incredible inequality, both in reality and in intellectual justification for it. I just reviewed and highly recommend Anthony Annette's book, Cathonomics, How Catholic Social Teaching Can create a more just economy. A really, really important book. It should be taught in every Catholic. Is there a business school here at the University of San Diego? Yes, there's a business school. What is it? Does it have a name? Is it named for someone? Yeah. I'm a firm believer that the only Catholic university should only have business schools that are called the Dorothy Day School of Business, because she famously said capitalism was the dirty, rotten system. But anyway, Tony Annette in this book points out that in 1980, inequality was similar between the regions, Western Europe and the US. The top 1% gained about 10% of all income. And by 2016, this figure had nudged up from 10 to 12% in Western Europe. But in the United States, it had gone up to 20%. 1% of the population, 20% of the wealth. Conversely, for the bottom 50% share of wealth, it is held steady in Western Europe, but in the United States, it fell from over 20% in 1980 to barely 12% in 2016, a mirror image of the top 1%. And those numbers are actually worse for wealth than they are for income. This was not, and then we look at some of the polarization in our society, and so the place where I go to church in Connecticut, it's an old mill town, and when the jobs left, guess what? Nothing came back. I mean, the only job that with growth potential in that town now is opioids, and then treating addiction. I mean, it's those jobs left, and they're gone. And we were told, well, this is going to get better. This is free trade. It didn't happen. The third thing that happened then, of course, is in the 1990s with the end of history, right? The communism falls, and there was this kind of triumphalism about, oh, this is just, again, the free market, and meritocracy starts entering the language of the left, not just the language of the right. And you get a kind of social Darwinian sensibility on the left as well as on the right. And this is not us. I don't know where, how that happened so uncritically. And yet you also at that time, again, see the backlash with Pat Buchanan. It was 1992 was when he ran against Papa Bush for the Republican nomination. And he failed, but he did pretty well in New Hampshire. He was popular. And when he gave that great famous speech in the convention that year, there was a following. And it was, again, that link to Wallace and maybe Goldwater before him. But go back and read one of Pat Buchanan's 1992 speeches, Close Your Eyes, and it's Donald Trump in 2016. So we've been here before. So then we get to where are we now? And I think on the right, obviously, you've seen Trumpian populism has kind of replaced that neoliberal, or what we tend to call in America, neoconservative politics and ideology. But interestingly, they held on to what? This kind of slavish devotion to capitalism. That's, Donald Trump talked a good game about trade and all this kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, he didn't get the infrastructure bill through Congress. He did get the tax cuts for the rich through Congress. I mean, that to me was a very telling thing. On the left, you see the rise of identity politics and how that has eclipsed traditional class-based focus of the Democrats. In 1946, one of my great heroes, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., wrote his book, The Age of Jackson, and the last chapter is called Patterns of American Democracy. And he wrote, and this is always still my kind of definition of what it means to be a liberal in America. American democracy has come to accept the struggle among competing groups for the control of the state as a positive virtue, indeed as the only foundation for liberty. The business community has been ordinarily the most powerful of these groups, and liberalism in America has been ordinarily the movement on the part of other sections of society to restrain the power of the business community. That's not the party of Bill and Hillary Clinton. That was the party of Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey, and it changed in the 1990s and on into the 20th century with the emergence of this identity politics, right? I don't know if I mentioned Leon earlier, Leon Wieseltier. He should be the literary editor of the New Republic. He's the person, if you want somebody to blame for he's the one who got me writing. My first essay for him was a book, a biography of Jose Maria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei. But anyway, Leon did a great essay and small book called Against Identity in the 1990s. And I remember it's a collection of aphorisms. And the one I remember best was, I hear it said of a man that he leads a double life. And I think to myself, just two? You know, this idea of our time of identity, it's a thin idea. And it's not very sociable because it's rooted in logic. A equals A, sameness. Identity is sameness. And yet I think as a diagnosis for what's wrong with the kind of intellectual climate on the left, you can't escape that, the prominence of this identity issues. And that the left remains more motivated politically by culture war issues. If you're running for office, again, as I said, you used to have a fair number of pro-life Democrats, and it doesn't happen anymore. You can't win a primary. You can't, you're going to have organized groups. You used to not be able to win a Democratic primary if the unions opposed you. Now you can, but you can't if NARAL opposes you, or if the Human Rights Campaign Fund opposes you. That's where the money is and the juice in the Democratic Party now. Whereas with the Republicans, I think the juice is still with the economic, plutocracy. The other thing I want to just say about the money is, and to kind of demonstrate how this works, and I worked on a couple campaigns, and I would find this anecdotally, but anecdotes are one thing. But in 2016, there's a political scientist, Lee Drutman. We've got a political science student here. Lee Drutman is at the New America Foundation in Washington now. And he charted a variety of exit poll surveys. Exit polls are like these 60,000, questions that are asked. And what he was after, he said, people say, are you a liberal or are you a conservative? But what he found was, there are really two questions embedded in there. Are you liberal on economic issues or liberal on social issues? And he charted the answers. And so the quadrant down here, where you're conservative on both economic and political issues, that's about a quarter of the population, and that's the base of the Republican Party. Those who are liberal on both, opposite, are the base of the Democratic Party, a little bit less. I think it was like 22% of the population. And this was when Mike Bloomberg and Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, were running for the presidency, briefly before Elizabeth Warren slayed Mike Bloomberg in like a minute of the best television ever. But they were running as fiscally conservative, socially liberal. And Drutman said, is there a constituency for this? Is that what it means to be a centrist in America? Anyone want to guess what percentage of that population is fiscally conservative and socially liberal? 3.8%. Now, the opposite one, what I would call Pope Francis voters, a little bit more conservative socially, but economically liberal, 28.9% of the electorate fit that model, but there's no way to run as a Pope Francis voter who's, say, pro-life and pro-labor union. What party do you go to? This is shocking to me. But again, it's the money. If you want to run for Congress now, do you know what you get to do 5 days a week? You sit in a room with one or two people opposite you with two phones. And as you're finishing, thank you for that pledge, that person starts dialing the next person. You spend 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, dialing for dollars to raise money. Well, talk about a dehumanizing experience. And then we wonder why Congress is so incapable, because that's what it takes to get in there. Mark Twain, a great Connecticut, not native, but he lived in Connecticut at the height of his career, famously said, suppose you are a member of Congress, and suppose you are an idiot, but I repeat myself. So undergirding all of this, I did a conference, and I want to move this along. So I did a conference about 10 days ago, helped organize in Chicago, and we got some bishops and theologians together. And one of the smartest observations came from one bishop who said, we live at a time when we have a culture of grievance, but we as Catholics have a theology of grace and gratitude. How do you overcome that? I'm still working that out. and sitting with that and thinking, and I'm not a theologian. I only pretend to be a theologian on the internet. But those of you who are theologians, I want you to start thinking about these deeper issues. And it dovetails with something that's been bothering me, but again, it hasn't gotten to the point where I can write about it yet. We're now into the end of a second generation who has been raised on Foucault and Derrida and the whole deconstructionist approach to culture, that you look behind the culture. You don't believe the narrative of the culture. There's power relations behind it and all of that. And that's important. But we've lost the ability to teach people how to create culture. We don't know how to construct it. We only know how to deconstruct it. And this came home to me in the confirmation hearings of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was for 3 years a student at Harvard Law School, as was her nemesis, Ted Cruz. And they apparently have nothing in common from that experience. How is that intellectually possible? And so there's something weird in the American Academy that we have to get that out. What we have to start again figuring out. I think this is a prerequisite for evangelization. We have to create culture again. And again, this gets above my intellectual pay grade real fast, but these are deep underlying issues I think we've got to start figuring out. And so that's why I guess where I always like to finish these talks is what can we do as individuals and as citizens, as students, soon to be going into the workforce, and as a church. And I guess the first thing is we have to, and this isn't something, if I was talking to you 7 years ago, I would have thought needed to be said, but sadly it does. We have to support democracy. You have to get out there and really realize that this is something that is threatened, and we have to help. How do you do that? What does it mean to support democracy? First, I think it's cultivating habits of mind, really understanding the value of a free press, of freedom of speech, of the right of petition of government, of all those rights that are embedded in our Constitution. Secondly, and here your former governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, has been a great leader on nonpartisan redistricting. If we don't get a handle on this, if politicians get to pick the voters rather than the other way around, you get increasing polarization. So I think this year they're saying there may be 60, maybe even 70 seats that are in play out of 435 House races. Think about that for a minute. So 350 races are decided as soon as you know who the Democratic or the Republican nominee is. There's no effective contest in November. What that means is the incumbent only has to worry about a challenge from their ideological extreme. A Republican has to worry about a challenge in the primary from the right, or a Democrat from the left in the primary. Why do you think Republicans are not going to vote for Judge Jackson's confirmation? She's as qualified as any, because that guarantees they're going to get a primary challenge. Like if you're a Republican, you vote for a Democratic nominee to the Supreme Court, you are going to have somebody challenge you in the primaries. We have to address that problem. 2, voting rights. Again, 7 years ago, who thought we would have to argue for voting rights? It seemed like saying the sun rises in the east. Well, guess what? In America right now, in certain ways, the sun is rising in the west, and we have to confront this. Good government. And again, that going back to that Reagan quote, and to not be distrustful of government, to get involved in government, especially in local government. Scary stuff is going on in school boards and school board elections in America. Run for school board if you care about education. It matters. There are book burners, at the gates, and that has to be stopped. And then as Catholics, I think we also have to remind ourselves not to invest politics with too much. Our master did famously say his kingdom was not of this world, and it's not. And when the Democrats win, it's a victory for Democrats. It's not the eschaton. It's not the end time. It's not the dawning of the kingdom. It may be a good thing if you're a Democrat, but that's all it is. Second thing, I think, so that's all under supporting democracy. Second, I would say we have to allow our religious commitments to challenge our political commitments, not the other way around. And if you actually want to keep the polarization of politics out of the church, the price of admission is the willingness to challenge your political allies on the basis of your religious commitments. If you're a Democrat, do not be afraid to challenge the party on its stance on abortion. As a Catholic, we don't think taking a human life is a good thing. The politics of that, how you legislate that, is enormously complicated. We can debate that from here to eternity, but we don't owe anybody an apology for saying we think it's wrong. We don't like it when actually a group of human beings, especially ones who are little and voiceless, are just ironed out of the equation. That's not how Catholics approach it. If you're a Republican, I've got a long list of things you should be objecting to, from climate change to taxes to immigration policy, but challenge them. Don't, if religion gives you nothing else, it gives you a firm place to stand and critique your culture and your times. Like, let it do that. I'd also, in that regard, just say Catholic social teaching enlightens every issue it touches. There is no issue that is not, that your sense of how this could be resolved and made better is not enlivened by Catholic social teaching, or at least I've not encountered that. Third, I think we have to stop with the prophetic voice. I'm so tired of people saying, well, I want to find my prophetic voice. Okay. There are so many issues that in this era of special interest and crisis management and the need to fundraise that, give you an example. There was, you've probably read about in Indianapolis, there were two gay male teachers, one at the Cathedral High School, one at the Jesuit High School. And they got married, as you can do legally in this country now. And the one was fired and the other wasn't. It became this huge cause célèbre. Now that's a contract dispute. At any given day in America, there are thousands, millions of contract disputes going. Why did that have to go to DEFCON 5 like in a day? And part of the reason is there are interests that they depend on that for fundraising. They need the fight. There's this weird symbiotic relationship that is developed in Washington between groups that favor gay rights and those that oppose it, between those that favor abortion rights and those that oppose them. And that's all I can say. It's symbiotic. They need the crisis. They need that sense of heightened activity because they have a fundraising drive coming up. It's corrupting our politics, and we've got to figure out ways to resist that. And what I find is increasingly in our political discourse, these cliches. I'm going to speak truth to power. Okay, well, what does that mean? Oh, I'm going to be on the right side of history. What a horrible totalitarian. This is Stalinist. You don't get to verdict. The history will render its own verdicts. We don't know what that history is going to be. A friend of mine was just in Britain, and he went to Hadrian's Wall. And it's scary when you think of Donald Trump to think about this, but the people that took down the Roman Empire were theologically very unsophisticated compared to the Romans. And the cement that was used to hold Hadrian's Wall together, that technology of how you make cement goes away for like 1,200 years before somebody figures it out again. There can always be another dark age. So when somebody goes on TV and says, well, you want to be on the right side of history, I want to say, you are an idiot. Like, what does that mean? Stop it. No cliches. Fourth, inform your conscience, especially about what the church teaches about conscience. Again, an area where people are not, don't understand. Well, my conscience tells me, and how many times we heard this in the vax debate, my conscience tells me that I'm not going to get a vaccine. And people would want religious exemptions for this at Catholic organizations. And the Catholic bishops or the priest or whatever would say, there's no religious exemption here. You're a Catholic. We don't believe that. You have to follow your conscience, but you have to inform your conscience. We see up here on one of the murals, John Henry Newman. And if you've never read, everyone should read everything John Henry Newman wrote, just because he is the great prose stylist of the 19th century. But in his great letter to the Duke of Norfolk on conscience, he writes, "The rule and measure of duty is not utility, nor expedience, nor the happiness of the greatest number, nor state convenience, nor fitness, order, and the pulchrum. Conscience is not a long-sighted selfishness, nor desire to be consistent with oneself, but it is a messenger from him who, both in nature and in grace, speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas. And even though the eternal priesthood throughout the church could cease to be, in it, the sacerdotal principle would remain and would have a sway. If he had not written the sermon, The Second Spring, or the great autobiography, The Apologia Pro Vita Sua, or the great poem, The Dream of Gerontius, if he had just written that paragraph, he would still be the greatest English prose stylist of the 19th century. That the phrase, the aboriginal vicar of Christ. Remember we used to see the pictures that you've got the devil on one side and the angel talking to you. That's conscience is God's voice. It's not your whim. It's not self-assertion. It's God's voice telling you in this circumstance, what are you called to do given these circumstances? So please teach your children, teach your friends about conscience. It is critical. Fifth and lastly, develop a Catholic worldview. And again, this is something I'm still working out. I haven't written an essay on this yet, but you need a worldview. You can't get up in the morning and start fresh every day. Culture can carry you, but as we discussed, like our culture is not in a good spot right now for carrying anybody. So you have to create certain ideas about the world to help you navigate it. You don't want that to become an ideology. And I think I'm still working out, like, what are the habits of mind? What are the questions that we ask ourselves to make sure a worldview doesn't become any ideological? How you go, you put horses on on a horse, you put blinders to focus them and keep them from distraction, but you don't actually want to blind the horse. And I think we blind ourselves when our ideas become rigid and ideology. But you do have to have a Catholic worldview. It has to be open to life. It has to believe in truth. It has to reflect the incarnation as you have to believe in human dignity. And we were talking earlier about these horrible pictures this morning on the front page of the Times of, this old woman in her garden in Bucha, Ukraine, just walking over dead bodies. And it's not easy to believe in human dignity when you see that. This isn't facile. We have to wrestle with this. It's hard to believe in an all-loving, all-powerful God when you see that. Where was he yesterday and the day before in Ukraine? That this happens. And I don't know that there's answers for that. I do know, and I'm acutely aware of this here in San Diego, that some of the answers that I think ail the US church are found in the gifts that the Latino church brings. I think the Latino church is more affective. It's more relational. I think it's less moralistic than the U.S. church. It's certainly less Pelagian and less given to Jansenistic. I'm Irish. My mother was a lovely woman, but she was an Irish Jansenist, and you don't have that in Latin culture. So that's the first thing, is I think we've got to look to the Latino church and hope and find ways to make sure that they're allowed to keep the gifts that they can bring, because they may be what our Anglo church needs. You have to create a disposition. The most dominant intellectual habit of Catholicism is the the both and. So we don't do either or. That's kind of a Lutheran Calvinistic proposition. We always say grace and nature, right? It's that both and quality. It's the crucified and risen. It's that you hold on to those things. And sometimes you can't resolve it. You can't create a synthesis. So you just have to learn to live with the tension that is created by having two things that are not immediately reconcilable. And then I guess the last thing is ora et labora was the motto of monastic life, to work and to pray. And I don't think there's any substitute. I think you've got to get out and we just have to do it. We have to get into the world as Catholics and show up and try to make a difference. Whether we're going to make a difference or not is up to history and time and God's grace. But, at the Second Vatican Council, the Council Fathers opened the great dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, with these words: Christ is the light of nations. Because this is so, this sacred synod gathered together in the Holy Spirit eagerly desires, by proclaiming the gospel to every creature, to bring the light of Christ to all men and women, I would add, a lightly, brightly visible to the countenance of the church. Since the church is in Christ like a sacrament, or as a sign and instrument both of a very close-knit union with God and of the unity of the whole human race, it desires now to unfold more fully to the faithful of the church and to the whole world its own inner nature and universal mission. That phrase, a sign and instrument of the unity of the whole human race, is what our church is called to be at its best. And I think we just have to keep looking for ways to go out and do that. Thank you. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. And so for those of you who are at home on Zoom, if you have a question, please type your question into the chat room and we'll relay the question to Michael. For those of you who are here, you're welcome to voice your, but I'll get the other microphone for you so you can speak. I would like to start with just a question. So you kind of touched on this, but one of the things that I'm interested in is the transfer of these allegiances to Republican and Democrats to factions within the church. Could you speak about that a little bit?
It is strange to me that in a society that is as secular in so many ways as ours, one of the biggest indicators of how somebody is going to vote is to find out how often they go to church. I mean, that's just, and so it turns out part of the dynamic is, I think, especially with Catholics, the left, they left. Right? The Catholic Church in this country has become, in the Anglosphere, not in the Latino church, it's an upper middle class club for people with conservative sexual ethics. That's what it's become. I go to bishops' meetings every year, and that's who they speak to and about, and that's who their catechesis is for. And when they say that they're going to evangelize, that's the gospel they're evangelizing. I don't understand it. So how did it conflate with the politics? Again, this, I think, is the teasing out and self-separation that's going on, you can say, from Roe, from the counterculture in the early 70s, where if you go to Mass on Sunday, you can predict how that person is going to vote on a whole host of issues that ostensibly really doesn't necessarily, and even in their mind, may not correspond to the teachings of their church. Evangelical Christians are Christians. They worship a crucified God who, spoke frequently about the poor and not once about homosexuality. And you wouldn't know that to, go to listen to some of these preachers. Or you look at some of the distortions of the prosperity gospel and what that's done to our teaching on economy. Go back to the Hebrew scriptures if you want to know what a divine economy looks like. Every 7 years, all debt gets wiped out. I'm in favor of that. I was in favor of that when I had a lot of credit card debt. Actually, I really, but I'm saying, like, we don't have that notion anymore. Well, why? When did that become a bad idea? There's our social teachings. We were talking about this last night. I think one of the reasons we did a bad job is when you hear Catholic social teaching, people, he's not up here, Leo the 13th, they think, oh, well, that's Leo the 13th, 1891, Rerum Novarum, like it just dropped out of the sky. No, these are rooted in our scriptures and in our doctrines. So at this conference I helped organize in Chicago, one of the presenters said that when Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis's last encyclical came out, she had gotten a call from the press saying, what's this crazy new idea about the universal destination of goods? And it's like, this is St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century is talking about there's nothing new in this, but we have not done a very good job teaching of it. And that's, again, where I think our Catholic identity became tied up with, well, there was a time when Catholic identity was tied up with your family and things like that. There's a great story of Cardinal Bernard and the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago. He gets made a cardinal in Rome and he goes up to see his family's house or village in northern Italy. And they, everyone comes out, and at the end of this huge celebration, he says, so I'll say mass first thing tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, and they all kind of start doing like this. And finally, the old nonna, the grandmother, says, "Io cattolico non fanatico." I'm a Catholic but not a fanatic. They weren't going to go to mass on a Tuesday. Like, it was like, what are you talking about? So, but that they were still Catholic because they were celebrating together. Like, that's what it was about. In America, it's become very notional. It's very propositional. To become Catholic is to believe these 5 things. And that's not our, it's very conscious, but that's not our tradition. I don't know how we get back to that, but that's the once you get into that notionalism and then the self-selection that is made possible by the, social media and all those things, I think it just compounds, and pretty soon you, and go back and read my biography of Jerry Falwell. There was a lot of money behind the effort to bring evangelicals into, they were staying away from politics for most of the 20th century. And when Jerry Falwell was first approached by the Republicans about getting involved, he said, "Oh, my people wouldn't like it if I preach from the pulpit." And they did polling to show that the people in pews were actually chomping at the bit to have politics. And Jerry was going to follow the money. And that rest is history.
Okay. Questions from this audience?
Uh-oh.
Michael, how does the idea of the perfectibility of man and societies throughout history track with what these trends that you're talking about?
Did everyone hear that? So the question was, how do the ideas of human perfectibility and I would say social progress would be the kind of social corollary of that track. It is a great quality of Catholic thought that we are not afraid of the reality of suffering or the fact of human tragedy, that there are problems that don't have explanations, that we believe at some level suffering is redemptive, but we can't make sense of that. I'm reading a book about a Catholic woman who, Ava Schneider, who became a great teacher of the Holocaust. And she originally wanted to write a book about what the Holocaust meant for Catholics. And Rabbi Heschel, Abraham Heschel, who's actually one of the saints pictured here, although I think he looks a little bit like Karl Marx in that picture. I think they were debating back and forth. But anyway, Heschel said to her, "There is no meaning to be garnered from the Holocaust. It's the absence of meaning." This goes back to St. Augustine, also up there. What is evil? Evil is an absence of the good, right? Like, this is, so the idea of perfectibility requires 2 things. One, it requires us to deny the transcendence of our mundane of reality. Too, as I pointed out earlier, I said, our kingdom is not of this world. You have to forget that, because if you're going to say the human person is perfectible, you're saying the kingdom can be of this world, and we don't believe that, or at least not on our watch, or on our time, or by our making it happen. And the second problem you do when you get that into a society, I'm not sure, and again, I'm still working this through, how that feeds a culture of grievance. Obviously, there are people who have a right to have grievances. Those people who lost their jobs when the jobs went overseas. African Americans in this culture have a lot of just reasons to have grievances. But it's when you create a culture of that, how is that premised on the idea that not that this can be better, but it has to be better, that somehow something is wrong. Well, something may be wrong, but it may not be that you're going to get to something that's perfectible. It's that you make it a little more discreet, a little bit more isolated, and fit it into a different kind of more Catholic narrative in which tragedy and sin, we're going into Holy Week, and John, we were talking the other night about the when John Paul did the luminous mysteries and the, what was it? Didn't he have like the 15th, like it was Jesus raised from the dead? No, on Good Friday, just sit with the fact he died. And that he was killed. Sit with that. Don't rush to. We know how the story ends, but don't rush it, because it's you have to have that front and center, or you have a distorted reality. I was very blessed. I was 2 years in seminary. Thanks be to God, I did not get ordained. I would have been an awful priest. But I had Charlie Curran, the great moral theologian, for the introduction to morals, and his approach was, he said, our moral life, like our dogmatic life, has to reflect our core beliefs, which are not moral beliefs. They're what? Creation, the fall, the incarnation, the redemption, and the eschaton. those 5 things have to fit in, and human perfectibility and the notion of a kind of complete progress forgets the fall and forgets that redemption is not something we achieve, but that was achieved for us. It also gets back to that point. What is the alternative to the culture of grievance? It has to be a culture of grace. So, look at the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, and solidarity begins with grace. I don't think but we Americans, we like the self-made man, the protean, that's not who we are anymore.
Hello. Would you say that the decline of the middle class in this country is why we are where we are today? Thank you.
It's part of it. It's part of it. I think the decline in the middle class, obviously, it's a symptom of the neoliberal economics and the growth of inequality, and it's being emptied out and forced into poverty or into wealth. And I don't know how economically there are steps that we can take that. It's disappointing that the Biden administration started out trying to get some of those things enacted and seems to have come a cropper with Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema. And I didn't know there were a whole lot of billionaires in West Virginia that were looking for tax cuts. I don't understand Manchin's position on that. But I think there is, but you can also see this in the church. 60 years ago, the bishop of any city in America would know the head of the local Federation of Labor. And I don't think that happens anymore. But you know what? On their boards, on the board of this university, on the boards of the Catholic hospitals, on the board, there's going to be a lot of rich corporate types. And so the imbalance that's created has even distorted the church's views. The church does a lousy job of implementing its own teaching for its own workers. Boy, there would be a place for us to start getting our house in order. So I don't know if that's entirely answering your question. I think the emptying of the middle class is both a symptom and a cause, and it creates a kind of feedback loop that's dangerous. And if we don't solve it, the consequences are really scary.
So Barb on Zoom has this question. She talks about how money is pushing evangelization with partners the USCCB selected, like Augustine Institute and several others. But her question is, do you think that synodality will have any effect and influence on the American church?
I don't know. It's a hope. It is so synodality is this idea that we as a church have to come together and listen to each other. The role of money in the church has become really scary in recent years, and it seeks to short circuit. So we were talking yesterday about the great Archbishop of San Francisco, Archbishop John Quinn, who used to say there were 3 types of donors. Those who give just because they love the mission of the church, and they're the vast majority of donors, and bless them, the church could do none of its ministries without them. The second is those who give because they care about the ministry, but they really like having their picture with the bishop in the newspaper or their name on a building. And those people are also good and loving, a little needy, but they. The third group does not seek to give, it seeks to buy. And that's that's the Tim Bushes, that's the Napa Institute. These are the people who give money in order to be able to help appoint certain professors at a university or to control certain dynamics in the church. They may pay to renovate an apartment for a cardinal in Rome and then expect favors back, and they get them. There's a bishop in California who will remain nameless, who became a bishop even though he had never been elected to any leadership in his order, nor he had any real pastoral activity, but he was Tim Bush's spiritual director. And that was enough to get you made a bishop. So I think there's the role of money is corrupting. Will synodality be enough to overcome it? I don't think so. I think if synodality, certainly not this little 2-year process, which we're still figuring out how that's even going to play out, that's not enough in this society to counteract it. But over time and with some other actors going on, and again, I think this incredible leadership that we're getting from the Holy Father that is deeply suspicious of the role of money, that in turn may help to get it out.
Okay, we're just about out of time. So you have a last statement you'd like to make to the University of San Diego here?
Amor omnia vincit. Love conquers all. I don't know. I think there's, I'm hopeful because I don't think there's any other way to walk through life. And I can't imagine for me, I'm sure for other people it's different. But my sense of hope is always grounded in my belief that the tomb is empty. That doesn't mean I can tell you what's going to happen tomorrow or in a year. Doesn't mean that American democracy is going to survive. But if that's true, and I believe it's as true as Lewis is holding a camera and taking a photograph, or that we're in this room in the University of San Diego, then you have to keep searching for the hope to keep going. And that's all we're not guaranteed anything but the promised wage for the laborer in the field. We have no reason to expect success to our efforts, but that's not a cop-out. It's our job to get up and do our job. So.
I want to thank Michael very much for a very inspiring talk. We're glad you came to San Diego. Continue to follow Michael and the National Catholic Reporter. We have a couple of events coming up as part of our Diversity Saints series. On April 26th, we have Latino and Latinx saints. Victor Carmona, our distinguished professor of theology, will be chairing that session. And then on May 2nd, we have Hoffman Espino, one of the leading Latino theologians, second only to Victor Carmona, here at the University of San Diego. So mark those on your calendars. Thank you very much for coming. We'll see you next time. Thanks.